me just thank first Harold for inviting me here, and Marko. This is my second home in Singapore. My first one was in NTU, so I went back home yesterday. Home looks very different. We do have a little satellite shop of IPS now in Hong Kong, and we meet from time to time with some affiliates. And indeed, there is almost every year that we have one or two more. So I'm going to invite you to join us in Hong Kong, maybe temporary or full time. I think it's your choice. But this is a talk that I have done before in a couple of places. So, the motivation behind this research was very simple. We've been doing public opinion research for a very long time, and we're trained as survey researchers, and we were pretty decent at it. And then the social media came about 7-8 years ago, and then most people doing this research were not social scientists, they were computational scientists, they were computer science, information studies, basically people who have nothing to do with public opinion, but they know how to crunch data. So we decided, well, let's see what these guys can crunch and how we can articulate this in sort of a bigger picture of social media and public opinion. So this is the agenda. I just want to talk very briefly about evolution of social scientific methods. I want to identify some issues regarding the differences in survey and social media data. There are some fundamental differences and some really interesting things that are happening when it comes to the social media data. And then basically what they did, we found everything that was published out there in the last couple of years on social media-based predictions. And we tried to do a meta-analysis and see what we actually know right now and what works and what doesn't work. And we also want to talk a little bit about representativeness versus node importance. In some future research direction, I'll also talk a little bit about recent research that we've done in Hong Kong about the protests, and just before that in Singapore. Okay, so it's been almost 6 years since I think this very important piece by Laser et al. In Publishing Science, where a bunch of social scientists and some computational scientists said there's a new world out there, the new gray world, and it's a world of computational social science. And when I read that piece, and this was in 2009, so 5 or 6 years ago, I realized, yes, there is something big happening out there, and we are not fully prepared, at least not as social scientists. So if you think about human interactions, we grew in a society where we didn't have enough data. We had to collect data. We don't really have that problem anymore. We still have to collect data in some way or the other, but now most of the data, most of our everyday interactions are recorded anyway. So we just have to find where it is. So with some of my friends from Information School in Michigan, we've been discussing the ways to talk about data. So traditional social scientists, they created data. They interviewed people, they did survey research, they did experiments. So this is created data. If you look at computational social scientists, they don't create data, they find data. They plug into API or they use a scrapper and just grab everything out. But it's a found data. It's not really data that they created themselves. So this is the first, I think, important distinction from today. Now, if you think about surveys, and most people who had social science training were trained to do at least some basic survey. There are some interesting things about survey. The first one is that they are solicited. So, namely, you're asked questions that you probably wouldn't be asked ordinarily. This is not, survey questions are somewhat unusual in most cases. And someone calls you in the middle of your dinner, usually NTU or IPS, or whoever does these, and says, hey, I just want to talk to you about some participation issues. I'm eating my dinner. No. I just heard from my NTU colleagues that they have problems because they called one guy 5 times. He claims that. He complains. So it's an issue. But anyway, it's a structured and systematic way to get data from people and ask them questions that they basically give responses to. Another important characteristic is that we, through the science of sort of statistics and mathematics, we learn how to generalize based on probability sampling. So we knew there are some rules, and this has been going on for a very long time. So even with the 500 people, 1,000 people, we can tell a lot of stories about a country that's as big as the United States. So that's the old way. The new way is this unsolicited, unstructured. And there are conversations, there are streams of data. So forget structure and forget questions, because they may not be answering your question. They may be talking about different things. And of course, if you look at what it really is, it's mostly word-of-mouth conversations. Sometimes you can say it's diary or ethnography. It's a slightly different type of data. And of course, we don't talk about sampling anymore as much. We talk about corpuses. So if you talk to a computer scientist, they don't even know what sampling is. just track all the data that's out there. So the issue of representativeness is getting a little trickier. So what do we like about social media analytics? There are a lot of things we like, and of course it's the cost near real time. People talk about everything and anything, so it's not just 50 questions that you get to ask when people survey. And of course the beautiful thing, it's longitudinal. So if you think about the data that, for instance, Twitter has or Facebook has or Weibo or WeChat or whatever, they have data for years of conversations. There's no such thing in survey research. You can have maybe a longitudinal tracking panel every couple of months, but this is different, I think, in terms of what kind of data you have across so many years. Now, the most important thing, of course, you can do cross-national comparative data. It's so easy, just plug into API. That's interesting. But what is, I think, the most interesting, I think this is sort of the take-home message, is the structure. With surveys, we had no structure. We had a bunch of anonymous people who were disconnected, giving us responses. But right now, we have the structure of human conversations. And that is, I think, fundamentally different. Okay? So we have the social networks and relationships between people. And I'm going to come back to this because once I talk about results, you will see that this is actually quite important. Just very briefly, it took almost 50 or 60 years to figure out how to do properly surveys. So it's been 80 years of survey research now. And every time we had some kind of information technology invention, surveys improved. So you had random digitaling, Caddy, now you have online panels. 2 or 3 things were never questioned. The first question, the thing that was not questioned until recently, was probability-based sampling. The idea that basically, if you want to generalize, there has to be some rules about how you sample people. They have to be probability-based or random, whatever. That was not questioned until recently. Online panels, of course, question that because they use quota matching. Different. They're just saying, we're going to make a sample that looks like a population of interest, but we're not using probability. So if you look at YouGov, what YouGov is doing in all these online providers, they are not doing probability, strictly speaking. Okay? They just say we get good results, and yeah, we're using a relatively sophisticated algorithm, but it's not probability-based. Now, here's a critical issue. Probability-based assumes that all opinions are worth the same. We know that's not true. Okay, that some opinions are worth a lot. So it works as long as you basically follow the principle of one person, one vote. So yes, if I do 1,000 people, I can generalize that 1,000 people, or let's say 5 million or 6 million people, I can have some ideas about how many people support certain policies. But I have no idea about the influence of these people. And I have no idea who is the driver of these public opinion trends. Okay? Now, here's the interesting thing. When I was digging for information, I found some studies. I'm going to show you the next slide. Some studies done a long time ago that thought of public opinion not as a bunch of individualized responses to a survey, but as content, as media content. So surveys were structured, they were based on probability, but there are other ways, and this is what I found. This guy is David Fan. He's a professor at, I think, Minnesota, and he's a biologist. But he's also interested in public opinion. This is the patent that he filed in 1990, okay, 25 years ago, which is exactly what we do now. Now, of course, he didn't have social media. He wanted basically to log into a database like, I don't know, LexisNexis or something like that, pull out all the content from newspapers and process it and, get some kind of public opinion. This is 25 years old. So there's nothing new about the new methods. It's just that the application is different, and of course what is different is that this was about old media, about traditional media. It wasn't about social conversation that we have access to right now. Okay, so just some comparison. If you look at survey data and social media data, and this is not a finite list, we can talk about this more. But if you look at what survey data gives us, it gives us content. So we have attention, affect, attitudes, values, preferences, all these things. We have the same thing if you get social media data, but we also have the structure and the network of communicators. That's totally different kind of data. Okay. If you look at data collection, of course, we're looking at structured. So we ask people questions, they give us response. That's not really how it works in social media, at least we're not the ones asking questions, someone else is asking questions, right? So unsolicited, unstructured, non-reactive expressions, either monologues or dialogues or conversations, okay? social structure, if we do survey research, we have no clue who these people are, and we don't know whether they're connected or not. We don't know whether they're influential or not. If you have Twitter data or Facebook data, you know who's influential. It's very easy to see that. Okay? So generally known social structure. For size of the data, I don't think this is very important, but something to keep in mind, at least for researchers who don't have access to kind of high-end computational input. Statistical assumptions. Probability sampling, non-probability. Most of the social media-based predictions are non-probability based. They either assume that they have all the data that's out there, or they just grab whatever is available. Okay, we'll come back to this. Just some examples. So, social media networks, online forums, picture sharing sites. You have connections among people, but you also have interesting things, connections between content. So if you look at Wikipedia is all hyperlinked contents, not people. There are no profiles on Wikipedia. Of course, there are people behind these contents. But if you look at, for instance, YouTube, you could be connected to another YouTuber, but you could also be connected with another YouTube video. So that's also new. That's a little bit different than before. Okay. So what are the challenges? The way I see them. First, the know-how. And I think know-how-wise, we're getting better. I'm organizing a summer school in June, where we're going to try to teach students, PhD students, how to do basically social media analytics and how to do meta-analysis. Because I think that's useful and usually not included in curriculum in most places. So know-how, and then of course the tricky part is APIs. API is an application programming interface. That's where you get the data from. These interfaces change all the time. And Twitter, Facebook, or whoever will not give you advance notice. Of course, unless you're the research organization working with them. But basically, if you're just a researcher, you have no clue what you're getting. And it could change randomly. So that's the first problem. Scale, of course, is a problem if you're collecting, terabytes and terabytes of data, but I don't think that's the major issue. Now, sampling and representatives. If you talk to survey researchers, that's the first thing they'll say. They'll say social media people totally different. Only 5 or 10% of people in Singapore use Twitter. In Hong Kong, no one uses Twitter, so if you get Twitter data, that's completely unrepresented. That may or may not be true, but doesn't mean it's not predictive. Okay, there's a representativeness issue, but there's predictiveness issue, right? I could be talking to 5 people who are the most influential people and who will give me the information I need, to predict, for instance, the elections. So if you look at the analysis and techniques, another problem is because these data sets tend to be very large, we have to use tools to process the data, tools that we know nothing about, tools that someone else programmed, right? So who knows what the functions are in some of these tools? Unless you're, of course, a computer scientist and you program those tools, you actually don't know what's going on. Now, here's an interesting thing about statistical assumptions. So here's a question for those of you who are fans of stats. When you think about social media data, there are 2 assumptions of statistical analysis that are often violated. Okay, the first one you can say, well, it's not probability sampling. Okay, fair enough. That's the easy one. What's the other one? What do you think? So you get data from, let's say, a bunch of Facebook users. There's one, and you try doing some kind of regressions or multivariate stats. What's the problem?
Distributions.
Distribution is also a problem, but there's another one problem, which is kind of weird.
The meaning. It's different for different contexts and different cultures. You say something might not mean the same thing.
Here's another problem, and this is, I think, a big problem. Independence of observations.
No.
So, nothing is independent anymore, right? If you grab data from, let's say, 100,000 activists on Facebook, they're all connected. What one says may influence the others. So you have a basic assumption violated here. Right? Scalability, computational issues, and of course lack of good theories. As social scientists, I was always trained to have a theory. If you look at a lot of computational research, there's no theory. For a lot of computer scientists or engineers, it's about whether something can be done. It's not about answering a research question. It's about whether you can create a software or service that can process this amount of data with some level of accuracy. It's not about testing theories. Okay. Now, for those of you who are a little more skeptical, and I am relatively skeptical but also optimistic about social media or big data, probably if you look at people's Facebook profiles or Instagrams, they are heavily curated. I have some friends who are not very attractive, but if you look at their Facebook profiles or Instagram, they look good, right? Because they are friends with Photoshop, they understand how to manipulate images, they understand how to manipulate their presentation, lot of curation going on. This is not real world. It's a world that was edited, curated, meant to look different. Okay, so that's one thing. So they're not really authentic. Another issue is, of course, the issue of the long tail. If you look at online communities, the participation is extremely skewed. So we started off with 80-20 rule, so 20% of people contributing 80% of content. That's actually not true. It's probably more like 99-1 rule. So 90% of people don't do anything. They just consume content. 9% do something, repost, forward, maybe edit, and then 1% actually create something. With Wikipedia, it's probably less than 1%. So if you think about online communities, or let's say online forums, probably most people are just lurking in the background. Okay? And I'll come back to this because this is a very important point. Okay? Also, API also already mentioned this. The problem with API is unless you have a relationship with a company, or you're buying data from a company that has a relationship with Twitter or Facebook, you actually have no clue what you're getting. If you're grabbing data from one location, you could be getting different data from someone who grabs it in, let's say, United States or somewhere else. So if we are just doing it the way we are used to do it, which is, just grab a couple of APIs and a couple of servers and just let's see how much data we get, it's probably not very good data. And you don't know whether it's good data or not. That's the problem. And of course, APIs shift all the time. Okay, this is more my complaint about being a researcher. I think for some of you this doesn't apply. Really big data, it's very difficult for the social scientists to get access to. It's very difficult. I can purchase it or I can partner with someone, but usually I don't have access to it. A few years ago, I think 2 years ago, one of the guys from, I think it was from Facebook, he said at a conference, an academic conference, I don't think that people who don't work for Facebook should be doing research on Facebook. Mm-hmm. That's, of course, people felt insulted and they said, who are you to tell me whether I can do research? But he had a point. He's the only person in the room who had access to data. And of course, he has national security agencies and research companies and all this, but basically we don't have access to it in most cases. The reason why this is problematic is because of replication. So he publishes a paper, I have no way of refuting his findings. I have to trust him. Right? Now compare that to survey, where we created our data. So if you show something through survey research, I can do my own survey and see whether this is true or false. Of course, from a perspective of digital divide, yes, in most countries now everyone has a phone and smartphone and all this. But compare, for instance, doing research in Bangladesh versus Singapore. There's not that much digital data in Bangladesh. So long term, there's going to be some serious differences in terms of how much we can learn about different societies. Okay, now let me just go briefly through my study. Let's see how I'm doing time. Okay. All right. We searched through most of the databases that are relevant here. So not just SSCI, just ACM, IEEE, everything. We found a bunch of studies, but then we only wanted to see the studies that were benchmarked against real-world elections or public opinion surveys. So we didn't want to focus on these social media predictions that just predict social media. So this is what we found, about 44 studies. As you can imagine, most of the studies are about Twitter because it's the easiest to get Twitter data. And it's mostly text data. So it's available. It's the availability here is, the data is out there, let's analyze something. Let's do a quick paper for the conference and let's do Twitter. You can see Weibo is appeared too. Some people are using search engines, which is not really social media data, but they're using Google Trends. But basically most of the research is about Twitter and some about Facebook. Whether they're trying to predict vote shares, seat numbers, public support rates, political disaffection, public attention, winning party. Most of them are focusing on the elections because it's the easiest. Right? And it's kind of sexy, although they're not really predicting elections. They're doing post-hoc predictions, which is totally different. Okay, now this is important. There are basically, of course, there are many approaches and tools and models that people use, but there are basically only three approaches. Volume-based is just counting names of political parties or political actors. Very simple, just brute power of counting. The second one is sentiment analysis, which should give us some ideas about how people feel or who they like and dislike. The problem with sentiment analysis, of course, it doesn't work that well, especially for politics. Then the last one is network analysis, and that's where things get really interesting. Because for the first two, you could say, well, we had this before. I can ask people what they like, what they dislike, what they think of politicians. I know that. But the third one we didn't have before, which is opinion leadership. So suddenly I know who is influential. Okay, we never had this data before, and that's, I think, very important data. Okay, now, just to bore you a little bit with results. So we were trying to see what works and what doesn't work, or what kind of combinations of these methods work best. So you have R-squares, mean average errors, correlations, accuracy rates, different ways, relatively simple ways of assessing how accurate your predictive model is. Most of them are predicting, again, elections. Some of them are predicting public opinion. Okay, so here's just to show you roughly what was happening. So they were trying to, in terms of what kind of predictions they're making, they're trying to predict who wins the elections or which candidate wins the election, vote share, number of seats, approval rates, popularity, what people think of the candidates. And these are some of the measures of predictive power. Let me just briefly go back to, this is one of the first studies that was done on the elections, and of course done in Singapore. This is done with my colleagues from SMU. I presented this before, it's a published study. We were just doing the counts, so brute force, just counting the number of times candidates were mentioned or political parties were mentioned. And, you know, if you look at the mean error, it's not bad. It's 5%. You know, it's not that far away from survey data. Survey data will be about 3 or 4% or something. So it's not too bad. Now, of course, if you look at the error looks kind of okay, unless you look at PAP.
Yeah.
Right? It's huge error there, right? So I thought, like, what's happening there? There are fewer people talking about PAP than those who support it. So you can say, well, you know, people support it are maybe more quiet. Maybe they're older, maybe they're less likely to use Twitter. Or maybe, you know, if you've been married for 30 years, you're not going to talk about your wife. You're going to talk about your lover. It's just not very exciting to talk about same old, right? Of course, the Workers' Party is very interesting here too, because there's more buzz than votes, and that's also to be sort of predicted, right? Because that's what opposition should do, to create more buzz, to create excitement, and that's what they did. Now, for some other parties, it was really accurate. Just look at the numbers. It's surprisingly accurate for a very simple analysis. We didn't even do the evaluations. There's no sentiment analysis, just counting. Okay. So we did the study, and I was kind of pleased that something was going on, but I couldn't really make more deeper sort of conclusions about this. So anyway, let me go back to how we measure these things. So these are, in terms of percentages, what kind of measures of predictive power they use. And these are the results. So if you look at volume-based analysis, the average error, mean average error, is about 6.8%, so about 7%, which is kind of large but not terrible. Okay, that's just volume, just counting. Volume plus network analysis is actually not bad. 85% accuracy in prediction. Classification accuracy also about 80%. Volume-based plus sentiment analysis is about 90% R-squared. So 90% of model is explained by it, which is not bad at all. Sentiment analysis, as you can see, doesn't work that well. I'll come back to this. There are several reasons why it doesn't work well. One is that sentiment analysis is still a little bit primitive. And the second one is, I think, more interesting. I'll come back to it.
Could you explain the numbers and columns?
Okay, so on the left, you have predictors. How, basically the models, whether they just counted, or use sentiment analysis, or use network analysis, or combination, right? The numbers, for instance, the first column, MAE, is mean average error, how much they were off. And they're off by about 6.8% on average, which, you know, is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. R-squared is basically percentage variance explained, and, you know, 89% is a lot. You never see this in social science, so I'm pretty impressed with that. Coefficient R, that's just correlation. Race-based accuracy. Race-based accuracy here is a little tricky because it's basically how many percentage of the time you're right in terms of guessing the winner of the elections. Okay. Of course, if you have 3 candidates, your chances are 30%. But if you have 2, it's 50%. So 80% may not be as impressive as it looks. Okay. Classification accuracy is the same thing. 80%. So kind of interesting. Something is obviously happening, but if you look at the combination, it's volume-based and network. So it looks like network analysis is bringing different kind of information here.
What's the classification for?
Classifying parties. So basically, who's going to win, and also the ranks. For instance, if I go back to this prediction, okay, yeah, we were off by 17%, but if you look at the ranks, we got all the parties right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No problem there. Okay. Now, just brief discussion. It looks like combination of approaches works better, and that's, I think, not surprising. It also looks like network analysis does better than either sentiment analysis or volume-based analysis. One of the suggestions is that perhaps structure of relationship is more important than what people say. And that kind of makes sense. Another thing that's really interesting is that there is a lot of error if you're analyzing what people say, especially if you use computational approaches, because they're still not that good. But what doesn't have as much error is the networks of relationships. Friendships don't change as much as what people say online. So the stability of networks is actually much better, and there's less error than if you just analyze the content. So think of the structure versus content, and where is basically there's less error in measurement of networks. Of course, there could be problems in terms of how things are operationalized and measured. If you look at a lot of sentiment analysis programs, they're very naive, and their accuracy is quite low. So I think for politics, I would be surprised if it's more than 60-70%. They cannot detect a lot of other things. There are other ways. You can do machine learning and whatnot, but basically sentiment analysis is not great yet. It will become better in years to come, but it's not great yet. So, why do I think it's interesting to talk about structure? If you think about analysis of social media content, this is what you get. You get those 1% or 10% or 5% of people who speak, right? But you only get that. But if you look at structure, you get the followers, right? So if you analyze only the content on Twitter, right, you would only get the guy who speaks out. But if you analyze the structure, you get the followers too. You get a flock. You get people who are influenced. And that's the new data that we didn't have before. Of course, for surveys, these guys would get everyone, at least in theory. Right? They would do random digitaling, and they would get representative sample and all this. But they would not get the conversations, and they would not get the structure. They would get everyone, but without the conversation, without the structure. Okay, so a couple of things just to think of, and some of my plans for research. We need to start triangulating very seriously. So I am reasonably optimistic about social media analytics, but I don't trust it much. So I would prefer to have traditional data, let's say survey data or interview data or whichever traditional data, or even ethnography, compared with social media data. I would prefer to have, of course, the survey data paralleled with social media data. That's what we are trying to do. So my next project, which is probably going to start next month, is to recruit a bunch of people on Mechanical Turk. Okay, there's a Chinese version of Mechanical Turk too. So recruit 500,000 people, give them a survey to fill out. Survey about social influence, interpersonal influence. Basically, who are these people who have influence in their real lives? They call them super diffusers, opinion makers, whatever. And then also grab their data from Twitter and see how this corresponds. Whether people who are really influential in life are also influential online, and vice versa. Okay, so that's the next project. Also, in terms of just understanding how good or how bad the data is, we have no standardized ways of reporting this. If you look at computer scientists, they don't care about a lot of these issues. If you look at people who work in public opinion field, they have to report everything. How they collected the data, how they sampled, average age, everything they need to report. So we need to get to that level where we are a little more standardized in terms of how we report our data collection, data analysis. What I'm interested in is not really the snapshots. Surveys were used mostly for snapshot stuff. So you take a snapshot and you say, okay, this is what public thinks. And then you take multiple snapshots if you do longitudinal stuff. And you have, I wouldn't say a movie, but you have some idea about moving images. What we have an opportunity to do here is to do opinion dynamics, to understand how it changes real time and to understand who the influencers are versus just taking a snapshot. So I think that's a real opportunity. Okay, now, here are some really difficult things for us. I work now in Hong Kong, and I have undergraduate classes and I have graduate classes. My undergraduate classes are about 90% Hong Kong Cantonese speaking Chinese. My master's class is 99% Mandarin speaking mainland Chinese. They use different media ecologies. So local students, Hong Kong students use WhatsApp. They use Facebook. That's it. The Mandarin speaking students from China, they use WeChat and probably nothing else. They may use like Instagram, Weibo, but they're not doing much over there. The problem, of course, with WhatsApp and KakaoTalk or WeChat is that we have no API. And the younger generation is switching to these networks that are not so visible anymore. Okay, so we got used to this idea that everything is going to be online and easily accessible. I think we're going back to the old ways, where most conversations are becoming semi-private. And that's going to be very difficult unless, of course, you're in WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is now Facebook, or you're in WeChat, and WeChat is a big Chinese company. So unless you have connections there, it's going to be very difficult to get data. So here's another thing. I think Singapore is a great country that can talk about these things. The conversation that I want to start is that you have social media companies that basically collect data from majority of citizens. Yet there is no requirement for them to share this data with anyone, right? But you can solve this with legislation. Right? You can have a law that says every year Facebook has to basically archive the data and give data to, let's say, government of Singapore. It has to be anonymized and all this fine, right? But they have to store the data because it's property of, let's say, Singapore citizens. It's going to be very difficult in future, especially for smaller countries, to have leverage over these companies. And again, these companies have a gold mine in terms of information. Right? So how do you sort of make them share this information? You can buy this information, but why not just mandate this by law? Okay. Of course, there's issues whether this should be anonymized, aggregated. Those are specifics. But I think there's time. The time is right now to start talking about data sharing, and that it's not just the privilege of the big companies or big governments, but also that basically if you are allowed to operate in your country, you should get some of that. Okay. So I'm not done yet, so I just want to say, I think we need to think of the new ways of public opinion, not trying to emulate what we were able to do with surveys. I think it's really about opinion change, opinion dynamics, identifying leaders. I think that's what's the main thing about social media. I don't think social media is going to replace surveys anytime soon. I don't think they should, because they're basically doing different things. Of course, it would be nicer to predict the future than to predict the present or the past. A lot of research is predicting the past. That's not terribly interesting. Okay? I would rather know who's going to influence people in 5 years from now than know who did that 5 years ago. Now, okay, very briefly, 2 studies. They're still in the works. The first one is survey-based data set collected in Singapore 2 years ago. The second one was collected during the protest last year in Hong Kong. The first one is a national RDD. The second one is a street intercept. So we basically sent kids to 8 campuses and during the protest and asked them a bunch of questions. What I was interested in is not whether people who express their opinions are more likely to participate in protests. That's interesting, but there are some other things I want to talk about. So, if you think about sort of civic engagement or politics, one thing that depresses turnout, so one thing that discourages people from voting or for participating politically is when they see too much dissonant information. If there is too much dissonant information, people cannot make up their minds. They become cynical and they say, I don't understand this issue, I'm going to stay away. So it doesn't work well for political participation. But a disagreement works well for civic engagement. Knowing that there are people who disagree with you, knowing that there are different people out there, it works better for civic engagement. So if you think about exposure that you have on Facebook. On Facebook you have about 300, 400, 500 people, depending how old you are, sometimes 1,000 people. They are slightly more diverse than your offline network. Not much, but slightly more diverse. So you're likely to be exposed to views that you don't like. To give you an example, a friend of mine from Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin Medicine, he realized that one of his old high school friends, he recently added her on Facebook. They haven't seen each other in 30 years. And he remembers that she was a very pious Catholic lady. And he started self-censoring himself when he talks about issues. She's one person out of 350 or almost 400 people that he has. But he started changing his expression, not to offend her. Okay? So he started thinking about it. Well, that's interesting. It looks like we do some sort of editing and shielding and whatnot. Let's do research on this. So this is what we did in Singapore. Of course, if you express yourself on social media, you're more likely to participate. And there's an interesting theoretical model why that works. I'm not going to get into that. What we also found is that when you shield yourself from disagreement, shielding yourself means unfriending people, hiding posts. Okay, that also works for political participation, party participation. So we found some links between attending political rallies or donating money to political parties and trying to shield yourself for things that you disagree with. Okay, but we also found that exposure to disagreement is important for community work. So that you know that there are people out there who think differently, who disagree with you, and it's sort of a good thing for you. And we were curious about whether these results are peculiar to Singapore or they work across the board. Okay. And guess what? We found this. So we interviewed about 800 students, and of course we were interested in how their social media use is related to their protest capacity, basically. Now, the protests were very impressive in terms of how civilized they were, and in terms of how, I think, motivated people were to stay there for 3-something months. But most people didn't stay there for very long. Okay, most people actually stayed for 1 or 2 days. Very few people stayed for more than 2 or 3 nights. Like very, very few. So we were interested in what's the difference between a person who went there to check it out, stayed there for a couple of hours, maybe a couple of days, and then left, and a person who was there as a core participant, as a core protester. And the difference is that basically those who are hardcore are much more likely to have to shield themselves from dissenting views. Okay? Delete friends, hide posts, engage in more uncivil dialogue, use foul language, because they have to defend their faith in protest. Okay, so compared to there are not huge differences, but there are significant differences. I'll give you an example. On average, about 2 or 3% of people who did not participate in protests deleted their friends because of politics. It's not a lot. 2 or 3% is not a lot. For those who participated, the number goes to maybe 5. But when you go to hardcore, the number goes to 10 or 15%. Okay? Now, 10 or 15% is substantively larger than 2%. Okay? And we found similar things for uncivil language and all this. So initially I thought, well, that's because those who are hardcore protesters, they're also more likely to hear these dissenting views. Right? So they have to defend themselves. Actually not true. They're all equally likely to hear things that they disagree with. But the hardcore people had to shield themselves from these different views, and they shielded themselves by deleting